Looks like a real shift in voters' priorities since the last EU election. What are the drivers here?
Well, Adrienne, so much has changed. I mean, in 2019, there was a green wave in the last European elections after Greta Thunberg put the Fridays for Future youth movement on the map, along with some massive climate demonstrations in European capitals. And all that really persuaded voters to elect more Green Party candidates and their allies. And then, as you mentioned, the EU Parliament came up with what's known as the Green Deal, those ambitious plans to slash CO2 emissions, curb the addiction to fossil fuels, and invest in green projects. So Europe was leading the way. But just think about it, Adrienne. 2019, that was before COVID, before rising inflation, before the war in Ukraine. And today, polls suggest that voters are thinking more about security and immigration. And what's that Green Deal going to cost us in the next 5 years? Their top priorities have shifted, and some politicians are stepping up now to exploit those fears, wielding climate policy as a wedge issue.
Okay, so I want to get into that in a second with Karl, but let's just remind people here, I think, of some basics of what we're talking about. So the European Union is made up of 27 countries, all of them with their respective national governments, of course. But every 5 years, the European citizens elect a European Parliament, which has 720 members or seats. So you have bigger countries like France and Germany. Obviously, they have more seats. Those members effectively run the EU, and they decide on things like financial rules and emissions targets. So, Karl, here's where we need your help. Can you help us understand the shifting priorities? Climate is an issue in this election, but the conversation has changed. It seems to be one we all need to pay attention to.
That's right, Adrienne. And look, Europe is almost like a global laboratory for climate policy. The EU has moved quickly to introduce far-reaching rules. So that means what happens in Europe holds lessons for the rest of the world as governments everywhere try to cut carbon and also keep people on board. And we've seen European farmers, for example, staging very intense protests over a range of concerns. And some of that is about green regulation. There's been a proposed law to control pesticide use, another one to restore degraded lands, and they were quite angry about those. But they're also angry about other things like unfair treatment by EU trade rules and supermarket pricing and things like that. And actually, farming is one of those industries that's so far been least touched by EU legislation. But there is a wider backlash going on as well. As Susan mentioned, there's wider challenges, the coronavirus, the Ukraine war, energy prices. We pay much more for natural gas, for example, in Europe than you do on the other side of the Atlantic. So that's left Europeans feeling concerned about the cost of living, and they're concerned about anything that might actually add to the hit pocket costs, including efforts to fight climate change.
So, Susan, I mean, presuming all of this is not to say that people have abandoned entirely concerns about climate change.
Right. I mean, polls show that over half of Europeans still think it's a priority to combat climate change. And record heat in Europe last summer and extreme weather events have only reinforced that concern. And you can't forget that renewable energy is soaring in Europe. Growth in solar, for example, up 60%. But there is resistance in some parts to the level of immigrants coming into Europe, certainly nationalistic sentiments. And then, look, as Karl just said, politics is in your pocketbook, and voters are asking, how do I afford new climate rules? So it's less about the need for climate change initiatives and more about how can I pay for them?
Okay, so we've talked about projections for the next European Parliament, which show, these Green Party candidates losing seats, gains for those on the right side of the political spectrum. Karl, how are the parties on the right talking about climate specifically?
So the context is, as Susan said, is really important. The EU's moved from setting abstract emissions cutting goals to concrete interventions that people are beginning to feel in their lives at home. The EU is now having a say about what type of car you can drive in the future, what type of job you might have, even how you heat your home. And these are necessary conversations that are really concrete for people. And coming at a time, as we said, where there's these hip pocket concerns. And that combination is feeding the far right's narrative, which is essentially to play on fears about Europe's decline, and ask people, are you going to let a bunch of bureaucrats in Brussels tell you what you can do in your home? And for example, in Germany, the far right, alongside migration and traditional issues, has been campaigning against heat pumps. And that's part of the reason why their Alternative for Deutschland, the far right party there, is currently in second in the polls. I've just returned from reporting in Slovakia, where the far right got into government attacking EU protections against bears. The parties that we refer to as far right, they might end up having the most seats in the EU Parliament after this election, according to our polling in Politico's poll of polls. But they don't all cooperate, and that won't actually mean that they control policy making. But the key will be how much they influence the parties in the centre who will control legislation. And after June, how much will those parties be pulled to the right?
Interesting. All right. So last thought to you, Susan. We started talking about what this might mean for the planet, especially in terms of environmental policy. So what is your sense of it?
Well, most people that I'm speaking to say that this Green Deal in Europe won't be tossed out. It could be diminished. If a shift to the conservative and far right translates to more power, as Karl just mentioned, in these elections, the analysts are going to say that it will be harder to push new climate legislation, and that the power shifts may dampen both the speed and the scope of the Green Deal. So it is a significant pushback, and that has echoes in Canada too. And the timing, say climate scientists, is reason to worry, because they believe we're already failing globally to bring down CO2 emissions overall, and this is the time, they suggest, to be even more aggressive, not less. But as we're seeing, the political winds, at least in Europe at this time, aren't aligning with that. And one more thought, Adrienne, you know, there is another big election this year in the US, and do expect more of a fight over climate policy there, with Donald Trump promising to, quote, I think he said, drill, baby, drill. And Joe Biden is fighting to hang on to the gains with his Inflation Reduction Act, pouring some money into climate initiatives. So that will be another election to watch this year on the Climate File.
Well, this is the year of more elections in almost a generation. So Susan and Karl, thank you both.
You're welcome.